12,000 Roman soldiers walked into the Syrian desert. None of them walked out. How does the most powerful army on earth get completely erased? Not by a larger force, not by superior numbers, but by an enemy that refused to fight them the way they trained for. That's the question nobody asks about Carrhae. And the answer will change everything you think you know about Roman military dominance. Rome in 53 BC was untouchable. The legions had crushed Gaul. They had broken Macedon. They had turned the Mediterranean into a Roman lake. The pilum, Rome's heavy javelin, could punch through a shield and bend on impact, making it impossible to pull out. The scutum, that curved rectangular shield, turned a Roman formation into a walking fortress. The testudo, the tortoise formation, was essentially a tank made of human beings and iron. Nobody beat the legions in open battle. Nobody, except one man did. And he didn't use a bigger army. He used a system, a weapon so perfectly engineered that it didn't just defeat Rome at Carrhae. It psychologically dismantled them. It made their training useless. It made their courage irrelevant. It made their famous discipline a death sentence. That weapon was the Parthian horse archer. And what they did on that desert plain was not luck. It was not improvisation. It was a precision-killing machine, thousands of years in the making, deployed with surgical patience against an enemy who never saw it coming. Stay with me, because this story goes much deeper than a battle. The Parthian Empire sat east of Rome's sphere, modern-day Iran, Iraq, and beyond. Greeks called it the land beyond the Euphrates. Romans considered it exotic, distant, vaguely threatening. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, one-third of the famous First Triumvirate alongside Caesar and Pompey, saw it as an opportunity. He wanted glory. Caesar had Gaul. Pompey had the East. Crassus needed a war. So in 53 BC, he marched 7 legions, roughly 40,000 men, east across the Euphrates and into Mesopotamia. His plan was simple. March hard. Find the Parthian army. Crush it. Return a conqueror. He found the Parthians at Carrhae, near modern-day Harran in southeastern Turkey. What happened next was not a battle. It was an education. The Parthian commander was a man named Surena. He was in his late 20s, which makes what follows even more astonishing. He commanded roughly 10,000 cavalry, vastly outnumbered by Rome's 40,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry. On paper, this should have been a massacre, and it was just not the one Rome expected. Surena had 2 types of cavalry, and understanding them is everything. The first type was the cataphract, heavily armored lancers, riders and horses both covered in scale armor, designed to punch through enemy lines like a living battering ram. These are the shock troops, the visible threat, the thing that kept your eyes busy. The second type was the real weapon, the horse archer, lightly armored, extraordinarily mobile, riding small steppe horses bred for endurance over centuries of Central Asian warfare. Each archer carried a composite bow, and this bow deserves its own story because it was one of the most sophisticated pieces of military technology in the ancient world. The Parthian composite bow was not a simple piece of wood. It was an engineering marvel, built from layers of wood, bone, and sinew, laminated together under tension, then shaped into a recurved design, meaning the tips curve away from the archer when unstrung. This geometry stored enormous energy. When drawn and released, it launched an arrow with roughly the force of a 100-pound draw weight, roughly twice what a standard longbow could produce. The effective range was around 50 to 175 meters. But accuracy wasn't even the primary goal at range. Volume was. Speed was. Psychological devastation was. A skilled Parthian horse archer could fire between 10 and 12 arrows per minute while riding. That means at full gallop, hooves thundering, body bouncing, he was knocking, drawing, and releasing an arrow every 5 to 6 seconds. And Surena brought 10,000 of them. Now do the math. 10,000 archers, each firing 10 arrows per minute. That's 100,000 arrows per minute raining down on the Roman formations. Every 60 seconds, without stopping, because Surena had solved the one problem that always limited horse archers in ancient warfare: ammunition. He brought a camel train. Not just a few camels, a dedicated logistical tail of 1,000 camels, each loaded with arrows. Every time a horse archer ran low, he broke off, rode back, resupplied, and returned to the line. This was not normal. No commander had done this before with this level of systematic precision. This was Surena's real genius. Not the tactics, not the cavalry, the supply chain. The Romans had trained for every kind of battle. They had drilled for infantry assaults, cavalry charges, siege warfare, urban combat. They had not trained for an enemy that simply never ran out of arrows and never came close enough to fight. Here's how it unfolded at Carrhae. Crassus had his legions in a large square formation, the classic defensive posture against cavalry. He expected the Parthians to charge. Every army charged eventually. You had to close the distance to kill. But Surena didn't charge. Instead, the Parthians began circling the Roman formation at distance, just riding in a great loop around the edges. The Romans could hear the hoofbeats, feel the ground shake, see the dust rising. Then the arrows started coming. The Romans raised their shields. The testudo formation, shields locked overhead and on the sides, was excellent protection. But here's what nobody tells you about the testudo under sustained arrow fire. You cannot move in it. Not really. Not fast. The moment you lock shields and cover your heads, you become a slow-moving block. You can shuffle forward, but coordination breaks down under pressure. And the moment any soldier lifted his shield to see, to breathe, to adjust, an arrow found him. The Parthians weren't trying to break the testudo. They were waiting for it to collapse from exhaustion. And it was working. The Roman soldiers had been marching through desert heat all day. The temperature in that region in June can reach 40 degrees Celsius, over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. In full legionary kit, the larica segmentata weighing roughly 9 kilograms, the scutum another 10 kilograms, helmet, gladius, pilum. A Roman soldier was carrying close to 40 kilograms of gear in conditions designed to kill an unencumbered man. They were thirsty. They were exhausted. And the arrows did not stop. The sound alone was a weapon. Ancient sources describe the Parthian drums, great hollow drums that made a sound like rolling thunder, used to coordinate attacks and to terrify the enemy. The Romans had never heard anything like it. The psychological pressure was relentless. And then Crassus made his first mistake. He sent his son, Publius Crassus, with roughly 5,000 soldiers, Gallic cavalry, and some legionaries, to chase off the horse archers. Publius was a decorated officer, a veteran of Caesar's Gallic campaigns. He was brave and he was aggressive, and that was exactly what Surena wanted. The Parthian horse archers fled. They galloped away from the Roman advance, creating just enough space to look like they were breaking. The Gauls and legionaries pursued. This was the feigned retreat, one of the oldest and most devastating tactics in steppe warfare, refined over centuries by nomadic cultures who understood that drawing an enemy out of formation was worth more than any frontal assault. When Publius Crassus had chased the horse archers far enough from the main body, the Parthians turned. The cataphracts, those heavily armored lancers who had been waiting, hit the flanks. The horse archers pivoted and resumed firing. The 5,000 Romans were now isolated, surrounded, and being killed from every direction. Publius Crassus died there. The Romans who survived carried his head back on a Parthian spear. Now, think about what that moment felt like for the soldiers watching from the main formation. They heard the retreat horns. They saw the dust cloud shift. They watched their comrades disappear over the horizon. And then they waited, and waited, and then they saw the cavalry returning, but not the right cavalry. A Parthian rider galloped up and threw something at the Roman lines. Publius Crassus's head, his father's head, thrown into the dust in front of 40,000 men. Marcus Crassus reportedly had to be physically supported by his officers after that moment. Some sources suggest he never psychologically recovered. He certainly never tactically recovered. The Romans tried to retreat as night fell. They made it to the town of Carrhae. But the retreat itself was chaos. Men separated in darkness. Officers giving contradictory orders. Soldiers abandoning the wounded. Over the following days, the Parthians hunted them down in small groups. Final numbers. According to Plutarch and other ancient sources, approximately 20,000 Roman soldiers killed, 10,000 captured. Very few escaped. Crassus himself was killed during a failed negotiation, possibly executed, possibly caught in a skirmish. Ancient sources disagree on the details, but agree on the outcome. 7 legionary standards, the eagles, the most sacred objects in the Roman military, were captured. This was a catastrophe beyond mere military defeat. Those eagles represented Rome's divine mandate to rule. Losing them was a spiritual wound. Now here is something most videos skip: the silk question. Ancient Chinese and Central Asian sources suggest that Parthian elites, including cavalry units, sometimes wore silk undergarments beneath their armor. This wasn't fashion. It was defensive technology. Silk has a remarkable property. It does not tear when punctured by an arrowhead. Instead, it wraps around the arrowhead as it penetrates, often preventing the metal from going as deep as it otherwise would, and critically, allowing the arrow to be removed more cleanly from a wound. Roman physicians at Carrhae would have encountered wounds they had never seen before, arrows embedded at unusual depths, some actually slowing inside silk-wrapped flesh, others creating entry wounds that were smaller and cleaner than expected. It's a small detail, but it represents something larger. The Parthians had weaponized every layer of this system, from the bow to the arrow to the armor to the logistics to the psychology. Nothing was accidental. Everything was optimized. Compare this to what Rome faced in other major defeats. At the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD, 3 Roman legions were ambushed and destroyed by Germanic tribes. But that was an ambush, terrain manipulation, the elimination of Roman mobility in a confined space. A single decisive engagement. Carrhae was different. It was a sustained, methodical killing operation in open terrain where Rome should have had every advantage. The Parthians didn't ambush the legions. They stood in front of them in the open desert and still won. That's the distinction. Rome knew how to fight in forests, in mountains, across rivers. They had contingencies for ambushes, but they had no answer for an enemy that was simultaneously too mobile to catch, too well supplied to exhaust, and too tactically disciplined to panic. No other ancient army had combined those 3 elements with Surena's level of precision. The Mongols would later perfect a version of this doctrine at continental scale. But in the ancient world, what Surena did at Carrhae was singular. Rome never forgot Carrhae. The lost eagles haunted Roman politics for decades. Augustus Caesar made their eventual return, negotiated diplomatically from Parthia in 20 BC, not won in battle. A massive propaganda victory, depicted on monuments and coins as a military triumph, even though not a single Roman soldier had crossed the Euphrates. That tells you everything. Rome was so shaken by what happened in that desert that getting back some bronze standards through diplomacy, 33 years later, was framed as a conquest. Surena himself never got to enjoy his victory. He was too good. The Parthian king, Oro II, apparently feared that a general capable of annihilating Rome's legions might eventually turn that capability toward a domestic audience. Surena was executed shortly after his triumph. He was still in his 20s. History has a habit of being ruthless toward the exceptional. So what was the secret weapon that decimated Rome's elite legions in the Deep East? It wasn't the composite bow, though the composite bow was extraordinary. It wasn't the horse archer, though the horse archer was lethal. It wasn't even the feigned retreat, though the feigned retreat was psychologically devastating. The secret weapon was the system. The integration of mobility, range, logistics, psychological warfare, and tactical discipline into a single coherent machine that could sustain pressure indefinitely. Surena understood something that Roman commanders hadn't fully confronted. You don't need to defeat an enemy's strengths. You need to make their strengths irrelevant. Rome's discipline was irrelevant when there was nothing to charge. Rome's pilum was irrelevant at 150 meters. Rome's famous endurance was irrelevant when a 20-year-old Parthian commander had brought enough arrows to outlast them. The legions didn't lose at Carrhae because they were outfought. They lost because they were outthought by a system that was designed specifically and precisely to turn their greatest strengths into fatal vulnerabilities. That is not luck. That is not geography. That is not a numbers game. That is engineering, applied to human beings, across a desert, with devastating precision. Here is the question I want you to think about and drop in the comments. If Rome had survived Carrhae and adapted, if they had developed their own answer to the Parthian horse archer doctrine, how would history have changed? Would the Silk Road have become a Roman road? Would Parthia have survived? Would the entire Eastern Hemisphere look different? Because that battle, that single afternoon in the Syrian desert, may have been the hinge point that separated the world we got from a world we can barely imagine. And if you want to understand what happened when another civilization actually did develop a perfect counter to the steppe archer, one that would eventually help doom entire empires and reshape Central Asia forever, that story is coming next. And it is every bit as ruthless as Carrhae.